Happy March. It's time for the madness, Xavier fans. It's March 2nd, and here's our Razor cast. That's Reaker and Zink talking Muskies basketball. Jim, how you doing today after a tough loss last night?
Oh, I'm here. Madness might have a little bit different definition for Xavier fans this morning. It's, a 6-game losing streak here, and there was a lot of positive in a lot of the games. A lot of the games were close. We thought were winnable. Last night, though, a couple things, just a couple terms as I left the Centos popped into my mind. One was free fall. The other was the wheels have come off.
Well, that's one of the things we're going to talk about as well. It's talking about a past Xavier champion and the Xavier chances of coming into the tournament, what's going on there. But we'll start with this past week. Now, we talked we talked for the past couple of weeks about what you're now turning a free fall that you didn't think would happen, and I wasn't hoping wouldn't happen. But now they have to beat DePaul on Saturday just to get the 19 wins. We'll talk about those tournament repercussions. Like you say, they're now they're hurting. I mean, this is another win at home where they're usually pretty solid to a not bad Marquette team, but now they've dropped to where they're only above St. John's, Georgetown, and DePaul, and they have a losing record in the conference. They're sitting at 18-11. Losses this past week to Seton Hall, Butler, and Marquette. 2 of those at home. I know you got to have a heavy heart, but you say there's some positives come out of it. Talk to us about where the Muskies are right now.
Well, again, in the Seton Hall game, and actually we were kind of watching that on the side when we were interviewing Dale Harmon last week, because we did that on that Wednesday night. And in that first half, it looked like, Blewett was back, moving pretty well. And, in fact, the Musketeers led 31-30 at halftime. You thought, okay, things are on track here. We're good to go. Of course, and is it on the road? Is that Seton Hall? You're dealing with Angel Delgado, who's one of the leading rebounders in the country, and just couldn't finish the deal. Again, 2 things we've talked about all year long, and we're just going to say it's not going to get fixed. I don't think it's gotten better a couple games, but it's still the only consistency about it is our inconsistency in the turnovers. Against Seton Hall, we had 13 turnovers. Again, I kind of say if you want to have a chance to win the game, you try to keep that under 10. And you've talked about it. You've talked about it since the first week of the season. I told you, it's not a problem. It'll be fine. But that's their free throw percentage. They only hit 63% in that game. And those 2 things are just the 2 things that continue to haunt them. And, as you sit there and watch turnovers, and not only the number of turnovers, here's the other thing I think you'll agree with. I think you've watched most of these games. It's when the turnovers happen and what type of turnovers they are. A lot of the turnovers have come near the end of the game. Maybe that's because this is a tired team playing with a short bench, but also a lot of the turnovers have come in situations where it gives the other team an easy offensive run out and scoring. In fact, not to jump ahead, but I think last night I saw a stat where Marquette scored 25 points off of turnovers, and you're just not going to beat a team when you give them that much.
Well, you mentioned that, and it's true, Jim, but if you just look at the stats from last night, and since you brought it up, Xavier's stat line doesn't look too bad except for those turnovers, 14 turnovers last night, but they shot almost 50% from the field, 45% from 3, 81% from the free throw line, again, out-rebounded the other team, but lost by 11. So that brings into play what you're talking about. Could it be that the defensive scheme just isn't working the way a Xavier team has been known for in the past?
Yeah, that's a good point, too. I'll bring up that this defense this last week has not been what Xavier fans expect, and I'm not quite sure. Again, you're missing Edmund Sumner, who was probably a better defender than people want to admit. I think Trayvon Blewett, who's usually been a pretty good defender, I don't think he's 100%. He's not going to make an excuse. But last night, and I'll give Coach Wojciechowski all the kudos in the world because I think he's a great coach and he had them very well prepared. But I'd have to look at the tape again. But they were running something and doing something that they were exploiting Xavier on the baseline. In fact, at one point during that game, it was almost like a layup drill. I think they got like 4 or 5 layups down the baseline in a row. And again, I'm not Chris Mack, and I don't have it all. But there was something that they had seen and something they were doing, and Xavier, they were getting a mismatch. And again, I saw the other thing we saw is Marquette players driving past Xavier players down the lane time and time again and scoring. And that's just something we're not used to seeing. So, yeah, I agree with you. The defense has not stepped it up, so that's another major problem. Because you're right. If you look at the stat line, it doesn't look too bad offensively. But, again, they weren't making many stops. My son texted me last night, and he said, hey, we just shot the lights out, which they did. But, again, I think Xavier was giving them too many quality shots.
Well, they did that. I mean, they shot 61% from the field and 57% from three-point land, as well as 85% from the free throws. But it brings up the point. We don't have to talk much about the Butler game. They're coming off a big win with Villanova, and they're back up to number 13 in the country. They're playing strong in a team we let go at Hinkle earlier in the year, but that wasn't that big of a surprising loss considering where the two teams are. But everything else.
Well, let me say this about the Butler game. Let me say this about the Butler game real quick. Sorry to interrupt you there, but you did ask for positives. The positive about that was, and I didn't get to see that game. I had to travel due to a personal commitment, so I did watch it on TV a little bit. And here's the positive about that: with 2 minutes left in the game, a game that had gone back and forth and back and forth. It was a very winnable game, but then they had 4 turnovers right in a row and let that game slip away. But, you're talking about a team that's ranked very, very highly and playing very, very well. They traded punch for punch with them pretty much the whole game and hung with them. And, in fact, those 2 categories I talked about, 11 turnovers, 77% at the free throw line, they did it. But, again, they just can't put that full game together and close out. And, again, those turnovers, the timing of those turnovers just killed them.
Yeah, well, let's say they basically tied at halftime, then lost by 8 in the second half, which is just one off the margin of victory. But, again, that Butler team is rising up at the same time, which leads us to our next question, which is, Xavier's spot. Now, we've been saying for weeks that they're a lock, and I believed that, based on their strength of schedule and their BPI and the RPI. But now if you're in the selection room and you see teams that have been on people's bubbles like a Seton Hall, a Providence, and a Marquette now above them in their conference standings, it begs the question, can they rest on that SOS and RPI and it doesn't matter what happens in the Big East tournament, or do they need a big run in the Big East tournament next week and possibly need to win it just to get into the NCAA?
That's a very, very good question. I tend to think if they don't win on Saturday, and especially if they lose their first game, which right now it's so confusing because I don't even know all the tie breakers, and there's those four teams or 4 or 5 teams they're all bunched together. But they think they might play DePaul again in the first round. If they would lose to DePaul and lose whoever they played first round in Big East, I'm not very excited to watch Selection Sunday. But again, it'll be interesting because I think their RPI and their strength of schedule is still going to be maybe a top 68, and maybe they still make it. But I don't know. At this point, I think they got to win on Saturday, or they're in trouble, real trouble. And I would guess maybe the NIT. I don't know. I'm not even sure how the NIT picks their teams. Sometimes there's ones who don't quite make the NCAA, and then they get passed over by the NIT. I'm not quite sure. And I know sometimes teams don't want to play in the NIT. So, but your perspective on that?
I think like last week we joked that Xavier fans are sounding a lot like Kevin Bacon there at the end of Animal House, but I think it's even more pungent now, remain calm, all is well, but we are getting a little trampled. Their RPI is down to 35. What really helps them is their strength of schedule, which is at number 8. But unfortunately, when you look at that, they've played a lot of tough teams, but they're only 10-12 against teams with a 500 record. 8 of the wins have come against teams with a less than 500 record, and some of those, tough teams like Clemson is sitting at 15-14 is one of their wins, but another one, Buffalo, is only at 16-14 in the MAC, and North Dakota State from your Big Sun League there with your Mastodons, they're sitting at 19-10, but you can't say that those equate, or even Eastern Washington. Those are some of the wins they've got on it. They're only 1-7 against teams in the top 25, and the one team they beat is Creighton, which is no longer in the top 25. They're down to around 35th, 36th when you tabulate the votes. So part of that isn't looking as strong as it was a couple of weeks ago. And so you've got to wonder, I'll tell you right now, if they lose on Saturday, which would be their first loss to an under 500 team, I think they're in real trouble. I don't think it's going to happen, but because the NCAA looks so strongly at how you finish sometimes, as we talked about in our Trogcast the other day, how competitive it gets with all these conference championships and people getting knocked off and the tightness for space. I think they need to have a strong run here in this Big East tournament to prove to people that they're tournament worthy.
Yeah, and I want to make the point, I think, and I see this last night, two things. The effort's there. The 6 or 7 players playing most of the minutes are giving their all. Rasheed Gaston, and of course, he came to Xavier to play in the NCAA tournament. And I'm sure right now the thought in his mind is, oh my, we're not going to make it. And I think Malcolm Bernard, same thing. He came here because he wanted to play on a team that would be in the NCAA and get to experience that, because neither one of them had experienced that in their careers at other schools. But I think that's part of it now. It's almost, I think, come into a mental thing. And you've coached some, and I've coached some. We've both been there. When a team starts to go through something like that, and you continue to lose games where by little things, if we'd have played this 4 minutes better, if we'd have made a play here, if we wouldn't have turned the ball over here, we would have won the game. It's almost like, well, I heard a broadcast last night. They're playing not to lose, not to win. They're playing not to lose, and that becomes a mental thing, I think, after a while, that it really gets into your psyche, and it's, I would not want to that situation coaching high school teams. I can't even imagine with the profile Xavier has and the media, and I'm sure the questions come every day. Hey, Coach, when are we going to turn this around? And you try to stay positive, but in the back of your mind, you're like, oh my gosh, this is major failure here.
Well, to get it, we've talked about where they are in the tournament, and I've always referred to Joe Lunardi from ESPN, who's been picking his bracketology all year. It's one thing I'll give him. It starts too early. He starts in like the second week of the season. About 3 weeks ago, he had Xavier at a 4 or 5 seed. Right now, he's got him in the play-in game. One of those teams this run, it could be very, very crucial. And we'll have to wait and see what happens with DePaul, a team they should beat unless they get in their head. I mean, a team that's coming in 2-15 in the league, 9-21 on the season. There have been other teams that have really surprised, like Marquette. St. John's is at 7-10, and they're 13-7. Great job by Chris Mullen there. And, of course, we know JT3's on the hot seat. Read a great article about him on ESPN where basically they're saying that the only reason he's keeping his job is because people are scared of his dad. But the DePaul team there in Chicago, it's a team they should win. They should get back off the schneid, get out of this losing streak. And then I think they've got to beat somebody that has beat them in this losing streak to in the Big East tournament to show the tournament selectors that they're going to be something, especially when Creighton, Seton Hall, Providence, Marquette now are all in that mix. And, at a time we thought there might be 4 or 5 or even 6 teams go from the Big East. It might only be 3.
Yeah, it's there's a lot to be determined in the next week. And you sound pretty sure about DePaul, but I'm not so sure because, let's think of the factors. It's at DePaul, so Xavier has to go on the road. It's going to be senior day. Billy Garrett, who, again, they haven't had a great run since he's been there, but he is highly respected as someone who came there to try to help them be better, and I think he's probably one of the favorite players there. It's going to be his final game. He could go off on senior day if the emotions and adrenaline hit him just right. We got to remember that DePaul should have beat Butler at home. If Billy Garrett makes a free throw in regulation, they do defeat Butler at home. I watched that game. And remember, they had Villanova on the ropes at Villanova. So we cannot take this easy. I mean, they could beat Xavier, and it's going to be a tough game, a gut-wrenching one, but I've planned my schedule. I will be watching, as every true Muskie fan I'm sure will be, hoping that we get this thing turned around.
I'm not saying it's a lock. I'm just saying this is a game they should win, and they're coming off the only team they've beaten in the past 3 weeks has been Georgetown by 2. That's the same team that you're doing. But let's shift gears here and think of a happier time. We talked with Dale Harmon last week, who was part of the Xavier squads there in the late 70s, and he said his big highlight was the Duquesne win that gave Xavier one of their first winning records in many years. It ended up 14-12 in his junior year. And as we talk about the NCAAs, and you asked Dale what it would be like to win a championship, we sometimes forget that Xavier does have a national championship, that they were the NIT champions in 1958, and it's quite a story about what happened there. Give you a little bit of the background. For those of you who don't know, the NIT now is known pretty much as a lesser thing, as Tim alluded to. If you don't get in the NCAAs, you go to the NIT. But for many years, it was considered the premier tournament in the country. And they also set it up so that the NCAA and NIT didn't conflict with each other. And all the games were played in New York at Madison Square Garden. So even into the mid-50s, this was a big thing to win that tournament. Most people probably remember, I think it was 54 when the City College of New York won both the NCAAs and the NIT, and there were a lot of times where teams played in both, or teams that would lose in the NIT would go on and make a good run in the NCAAs to show what it was like. So that 58 season, at least the tournament run, was pretty magical. Something that's interesting about that is, as we talk about the losing skid going on here, Xavier that year started 10-1, but they lost 10 of their last 15 games, and they'd already received an invitation to the NIT, and the NIT asked them to give it back. And Xavier said no, and went in as the last team in a 12-team field, and then ended up winning that tournament in an overtime game against rival Dayton in the first year of head coach Jim McCafferty. So as we talk about Xavier being on a rough spot now, 1958 tells us, Xavier fans, to never say die. Lots of good things can happen.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing when doing a little research this morning. I'm thinking, wow, this is very comparable. In fact, one of the key events in that season that led to that downturn, we can kind of compare here. What a player, Cornelius, they called him Corny Freeman, was their leading rebounder and averaged double digits. And he was declared ineligible for the second semester in January. And everything kind of took a turn after that, after they lost his rebounds and scoring. And I also wanted to go back to, and I've talked about before, I compare it to the 2004 season one of the greatest runs in Xavier's NCAA tournament history. In 2004, Lionel Chalmers was injured in January, and he didn't play a number of games. And I actually looked it up. They lost 5 of 6 in January, and again, they were buried deep in the standings of the A-10. And actually, it looked even more ominous. They had to play. If they were going to win the A-10 tournament, they had to play win 4 games in a row, which I think up until that point, maybe nobody had ever done that, maybe once. They had to have a play-in game. I think it was against St. Bonaventure. And if they won that, they had to turn around and play at noon the next day against the number 1 team in the country at the time, undefeated, St. Joe's. And, of course, Butler fans will remember they went on and they trounced St. Joe's, and it just propelled them. They actually won the semifinal game by about 20 points and defeated Dayton at the time, who I think finished 2nd or 3rd in the A-10 at Dayton. The tournament was actually at Dayton, but they went in and beat Dayton in the final game, going away by 10 or 11 points. That team just got hot at the right time, and that was the team that, of course, lost to Duke and almost became the first Xavier team to be a Final Four team in the NCAA. So, again, 2004, but we'll get back to 1958. Kind of the same thing. Actually, to add to what you said, they lost 7 of their last 8 games. And, in fact, I found where I couldn't get that, whether it was a New York newspaper or a Cincinnati newspaper, there was a story that was titled Xavier, Unheralded and Unwanted. Again, the NIT had asked them, can you resend? They didn't want them to come. They really did not want them to come because how their season had taken a downturn.
Yeah, it was a very interesting course of events, and you look at the teams that were in that, and there'll be some familiar names to Dayton, to Xavier fans. You know, Butler was in that tournament. Dayton, St. Bonaventure, St. Francis, St. John, St. Joseph, St. Peter's, Utah, who we played this year, as well as a Bradley team, which you don't hear about much, but that was right before the era when Bradley was a big team. They beat Niagara 95-86 in the first round, and then took that Bradley team 72-76 in the second. Pummeled St. Bonaventure by 19 in the semifinals, and then beat Dayton in overtime 78-74. It's a bit to note for our friends a little north of here that Dayton was a bit of a hard luck story in the NIT. They lost there to Xavier, even though they were ranked number 11 in the country at the time. And then, just a couple years before, Dayton was the NIT runner-up and played in the NCAAs, and they were runner-up 5 times before they finally won the NIT in '62. They won it again in '68. Just a year after they lost to UCLA in the NCAA finals. But to give you an idea of how big the NIT was in the 50s, in 1956, Louisville won the NIT championship, and that year they lost to Xavier by 40, 99-59. Now the sad part is Xavier was in that tournament, and they lost in the first round. In fact, in '56 they lost in their first game, as well as '57, and they won it. In '59, they had an under 500 record and weren't invited back. The thing is, a few years later, they did get their first invite to the NCAAs in 1961. They lost in the first round there and had to take the sting of watching the crosstown Cincinnati Bearcats win their first title. But it also helped put it in perspective, which I think Dale did last week, Jim, is Xavier doesn't go back to a tournament until Bob Stack takes them in 1983. So that's over 20 years without going to a postseason tournament. And we've been a little spoiled here that we've gone so many times in a row. Only once we haven't gone in the Chris Mack era. So that must have been a very special time in the late 50s. Basketball in Ohio, you got a great Dayton team, you got great Ohio State teams, you got great Cincinnati teams, and you've got Xavier bringing home a championship in '58. Ohio State and Cincinnati went to Final Fours. I think Cincinnati went to 5 Final Fours in a row, winning 2 and losing in the final game twice. So a special time. And I think you even have a nice story about an encounter with one of the members of the 58 squad, don't you?
Yeah, I was telling you, it's I'll keep this. I told you in a different manner, but I'll keep it a little more up top here. 2 years ago, I was over at Butler. I try to make the trip over there every year if I can, so close, and I have friends who are Butler fans in Indianapolis, so we try to make a get-together, an outing of it. And I think it was just 2 years ago I was over there and had walked into the bathroom and was standing there talking to a older gentleman who had Xavier gear on, and he actually initiated the conversation with me. I don't know if it was something, how I think we're going to win this game or whatever. We got into a conversation, and he said, yeah, I played at Xavier. And I said, really? And he said, yeah, I played on the 1958 NIT championship team. And as I told you, I didn't have the wherewithal to ask what his name was. And I was just like, I thought, that's cool. I go out and tell my buddies, like, hey, there's a guy in there that played on the 1958 NIT championship team. But I never asked him his name. So if you're listening to me and you recall that story, sorry about that. In fact, when I'm reading some of the history of this run that they made in 1958, I keep thinking maybe that was the guy that I was talking to as I come across some of the names in that. So, yeah, and in fact, here's another factor. Think about this. They go to New York. Nobody wants them there. The NITs basically told them they don't want them to come. They want them to rescind their bid. But, of course, Jim McCafferty, the coach, said, no, we got invited. We're coming. In that very first game, and you can imagine it doesn't take much to imagine because we're in it right now. In that very first game against Niagara, which was not a very high seed, this was almost like a play-in game because there were 12 teams, so there were 4 games to get into the final 8. They started out, Niagara was ahead 16-3. But, and you can imagine that it would have been very easy at that point to say, hey, it's over. In fact, I've read many, many times of many of the players saying that they only took one change of clothing with them. They did not expect to be there more than one game. And so that was kind of interesting. And just again, it's hard for us to imagine because most of us are familiar with what the NIT is today. Again, the second tournament, as a lot of people, you win the NIT, now they would say, okay, you finished 69th in the country because the other 68 in front of you. And, of course, there's always been a debate. Would you rather your team got into the NCAA and lost in the first round or went to the NIT and won it all? That's a debate I've had with many people over the years when you're in that position where you're not quite sure you're going to make the NCAA and you might make the NIT and you might even get some home games. That's the other thing about the NIT. They play that on campus. And so, that's something to ask yourself. But here was something that many sporting publications in the day called that Xavier win over Dayton. Again, it was a number 12 seed in the tournament. There were only 12 teams in it against the number 1 seed in the tournament. In fact, Xavier beat in order the number 2 seed, the number 3 seed, the number 1 seed in those final 3 games. Some sports publications called it the greatest upset ever in basketball history. That's what kind of accomplishment it was, considering where they came from and how they were able to win that tournament.
Yeah, it's good. And who knows? The guy next to him might have been Hank Stein, the MVP from the tournament, who I just, in doing my research, found there's a signed Hank Stein jersey on one of the online auction sites that just went up last October. So if you're looking for some key history there, and, of course, next year will be 60 years of that anniversary. That's a big thing in 2008 for them. It'll be it's just neat to have them come back. With the NIT, a great history there, and it was controversial even up to 1970 when the famous coach and curmudgeon Al McGuire refused an invitation to the NCAAs and accepted one to the NITs. I mean, it's 1970 when the NCAA had pretty much established itself as a better tournament, but that's because the NCAA was going to send them to Fort Worth, Texas, and he wanted to go to the regional that was being hosted in Dayton, Ohio. So he said no, and that means now that if you get an NCAA invitation, you have to accept it. You can't go on to another tournament. So lots of great history that's going on there. We hope that things turn around for the Muskies here on Saturday. They get a big win in Chicago, and they can make a run in the Big East tournament. But wherever they land, I know that the people in blue and white are going to be there cheering for them. And rough year, but hopefully they can finish strong like that 1958 team did. Anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I have a couple of stories I came across. Actually, I have a book in my personal library. It's called Xavier Tales, and I pulled that off the shelf just this morning because I knew there would be a lot of stories and things in there. So I'll share a few stories that I found very entertaining and interesting. One of the first ones was when they played St. Bonaventure, which would have been the second game, the number 2 seed. And Jim McCafferty, who, I don't know if we've mentioned this was his first year as coach. He was a young coach. But against St. Bonaventure, as they were preparing, there was actually a 2 or 3 day layoff between that Niagara win when they played the Bonnies. McCafferty installed a zone defense that they had never really played. And in fact, the story I was reading, one of the players, I guess, during practice said, "Why are we doing this? We have never done this all year long." And he said, "Trust me, it will work." And what he had discovered was St. Bonaventure was a very poor outside shooting team. And so they packed that zone in, and they actually beat the Bonnies very handily. And the story ended up saying that after that point, there was probably never, ever a player who questioned Jim McCafferty and his strategy. And they said he was not the greatest practice coach in the world, one of his players said. But when it came to game day, game night, game time, said he knew what he was doing, and his strategies were always right on. And he was one of the very first coaches they talked about who was just a student of film. He would study film over and over and over in developing strategies for game day. A couple more entertaining tidbits or stories is, and you can picture this, Jeff, because I believe they call it the Greater Cincinnati Airport, but it's what we call Lunken Field today. When the team left for New York, there were 2 fans there to send them off. When the team returned after winning the NIT, there were over 10,000 people there. In fact, reading an account of it, the crowd had spilled out onto the tarmac, and when the plane landed, they actually had to turn the engines off and leave it on the runway. They were afraid if it taxied in toward the terminal that somebody might get hurt from the jet engines running, or I guess it would have been props back then, probably still. So they stopped the airplane, turned it off, and they had to tow it into the presence of those 10,000 people. So, again, you and I have been to Lunken Field. We can imagine what that looked like. And you also see there's a famous picture where they walk off the plane. In fact, in the Muskie intro they have before the game, they have that picture where they're coming off the plane holding the trophy. And, again, there's a lot of famous pictures with all the people there. So, and the final story I have to tell, and this is I would love to hear this from the players involved. And I think it was Joe Viviano was one of them there, and the other teammate was Frank Tartarin, I think is how you say his name. They actually, the next morning after they had won the NIT, they went, and there were a few other players and coaches who went to St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City to attend morning mass. Well, they had not been to bed. They had been celebrating, interpret that however you want to interpret it, in 1958. But believe me, I'm sure they had not seen a bed or probably changed their clothing for quite a while. I'm not sure what time that game ended. But so they're sitting in mass, and Tartarin, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, started to feel lightheaded and realized he was not feeling good. The effects of the celebration all night long was starting to get to him during mass. So he got up and wanted to walk outside to get some fresh air to hopefully feel a little bit better. Well, Viviano tells a story. He's still in Mass, and an older lady walks in and gets him. Kind of alludes that it might have been like a street person, and walks in and says, "Hey, you might want to come out and check on your buddy." Well, what had happened is Tartarin, as he was walking out of the cathedral on the front steps, he fainted. He passed out and fell and cut his chin, and he was bleeding all over the place, and they had to rush him to the emergency room to get him sewed up, and he was it wasn't serious, but again, and I'm sure they laughed about it not too long after they realized it wasn't a serious injury, and I'm sure it's a story that gets told over and over again, but I just found that as, the Musketeers obviously enjoyed themselves in New York City, and again, in 1958, I'm sure probably very few of them had been to New York City to the Gardens, and again, they were the national darlings in 1958, something that, again, those men can always relish and look back on.
Quite a run. And that was the year that Adolph Rupp's team won a national final game. Lots of great history in Xavier basketball that we like to bring in from time to time, and also push the Muskies to the present. So, you ready? We'll shift gears here. I'm sure you found somewhere in that discussion a nice little trivia question to stump me on.
Jeffrey, I'm going to have to give you all the kudos in the world today, because I did have a question prepared for you. I should have known in your preparation for this broadcast. This is, I think, going to be a very easy question for you. In fact, I've actually been scanning my notes to come up with something different. But man, you did your homework on the 1958 team, so I'll give it to you. But unless you just choke, you're going to get this one correct. I thought this was would challenge you a little bit, but I know it's not going to, because the question was going to be what two current Big East teams were also in that 1958 NIT field, and you can easily answer
St. John's and Butler, because we already went down the list.
Yeah, when I heard you read off the whole field, I thought, oh, there goes that question. He's going to know this one.
Well, actually, St. John's is the all-time NIT champ. I think they've got 6 NIT championships. Of course, they often got invited because they're right there in New York.
And we're playing on their home floor, so that might have given them a little bit of an advantage, too. Oh, I do have one question for you. I thought this is a great trivia question, and you probably know since you mentioned it today. The Community College or City College of New York, are they the only ones to ever win NIT and NCAA in the same year?
Yes.
That's a good trivia question.
Yep. Only one. Unfortunately,
our basketball fans out there listening, you can use that on your friends here as the NCAA comes up. Probably not many people would be able to get that correct because the City College of New York's not a major player in NCAA basketball anymore.
There were a lot of times, a lot of things that, like in 1944, Utah won the NCAAs after being eliminated from the MIT. They ended up third place to Kentucky, but they went on to win the NCAA. So, there's a couple that have come close, but now nobody really plays in both. All right, let's get on to some fun little trivial tidbits. Got a few of them here. Big basketball fans will remember that today is the day that Wilt Chamberlain scored his 100-point game in the NBA when the 76ers beat the Knickerbockers 169-47. And here, you probably know this, Jim, that game was not played in New York or Philadelphia, but where was that game played?
Man, they were talking a lot about that on Mike and Mike this morning, which I usually watch very intently. But because do I was do I like chocolate? Oh, it's played in Hershey. Now I know, yeah, because I've been there.
Right,
I've been there, now I remember.
And they have no footage from that. Happy birthday to a slate of Xavier big names today. Romain Sato turns 36. And on Sunday, Mark Stanbrook will turn 25, along with ex-great and owner of one of only 4 Muskie retired numbers, Brian Grant, who played for the Muskies and had a long NBA career, will turn 45. And they share that today's birthday with Sam Houston, the only man to serve as president of one country and then governor of a state and senator in the U.S. He would have been 224 today, as well as Theodore Geisel, who many of us know for his lovable children's books Under the Noon Diplome of Dr. Seuss. He would have been 113 today. But my big trivia here, and I just ran across this in an article that caught my eye, was saying a sad farewell to an interesting footnote. Ned Garver, a fellow Ohio, then died in Bryan, Ohio, by Toledo earlier this week. He's one of only 2 Major League pitchers to win 20 games for a team that lost over 100. The 1951 St. Louis Browns are now the Baltimore Orioles. He was 20-12. The rest of the team was 32-90. No other pitcher on his team won more than 6. The only other time that happened was 1905 with Ned Young, who was 20-21 when pitchers pitched a lot more, for the Boston Bean Eaters, who were 51-0. To give you that idea, that means he won 38% of his team's games as a pitcher. The only time that's been surpassed is Steve Carlton won 27 when the Phillies stunk, and they only won 59, but they didn't lose 100. To give you an idea of how good this guy was on a bad team, he won at a 45% clip when his team only won 42% of their games. Now, if he'd have played for the Yankees, he finished his career with a record of 129 and 157. If he'd have played at the Yankees during that era and just evenly with the Yankees won, he'd have won 50 more games. So it's kind of a shout out to those that admire in those tough leagues and those tough teams, but continue to soldier on. Ned Garver. And this was the most interesting thing that I found. The St. Louis Browns were owned by the famous Bill Veeck. Veeck is in rec, who had all these great ways of publicizing his teams. One game, he let the fans be the manager. The manager sat in a rocking chair down the line, and fans had cards to say yes or no. They were asked a question, they were polled, and then that information was sent to the third base coach, and they did it. And Ned Garver started that game, and he gave up 3 runs in the first inning, and the fans were asked if they should start warming up a relief pitcher, and they said no. And Ned Garver went on to pitch a complete game and win that game 5-3 for the St. Louis Browns. So that's more trivia. It might be another way to get a drink, including the CCNY team of 1954. Ned Garver. Okay. Well, we thank you as always. Go ahead.
Well, I hope, Muskie fans, we've given you a little bit of optimism. Again, things aren't going well, but again, talking about the 2004 and especially what we spent on the 1958 team, if you are a true fan, you never give up hope because you never know when that special run might begin, and maybe 2017 will be one of those years. We never know. So keep the faith, and I know there's a lot of fans out there, no matter how well or poorly the Muskies do, that they're true fans. And so before you sign off, I'm just saying, go Muskies.
Go Muskies. And join us on Tuesday for our Trawcast about NCAA basketball. It's time to start looking at the tournaments. Some of them already started this week, and we'll be back on Thursday with more on Xavier basketball.